Hello and welcome to video number 3. We're going to talk about how to increase your actual attendee rate. Of course, this is a biggest problem that other marketers and other business owners face is getting their registrants to actually show up. But not you though, because you're about to learn some strategies on how to combat that. So how do we get people from maybe no or from maybe to yes? Well, what we can do is start with the basics. If you look at what things are successful and even how we are convinced to buy something from someone that we know, like, and trust, if we think about it, it often starts with mini actions. Things that we do that ultimately lead up to the purchase. So that might mean signing up for the webinar. That might mean downloading a checklist that the webinar host gives me. That might mean taking that checklist and spending 5 minutes on it, or doing something that checklist asks me to do. So many actions, if you do it in such a manner that it gains trust and you add value to that, because we're not just talking about any action, we're talking about specific actions that allow you to build a relationship with people, gain their trust, add value, add content, which becomes mini commitments. And these mini commitments ultimately become mini transactions. And of course, mini transactions ultimately become bigger transactions if they value your products, your services, and so forth. So if you have a better understanding of that, you'll understand why I recommend these strategies here. So let's talk about mini actions. How do we get people to take action initially when they sign up for the webinar? To do that, what we can do is we can give a checklist or an action list or a PDF file. You generally don't want to have something that's too long, but you don't want to have something that's too short either. Basically, what you want to do is you want to provide something, whether it's a case study or information or action list, checklist, whatever, containing some sort of sneak peek preview of what your webinar is going to be about. So maybe you have a checklist of something people need to do before they get to the webinar so that they can use whatever they have checked off that list in the webinar. So if you're doing that, what that does is it builds curiosity in their minds to want to check out the webinar to figure out why they needed the checklist in the first place. And it creates kind of this interesting but incomplete. So in order to find the complete version, they have to attend the webinar. So obviously you want to figure out what is it that my audience wants in terms of a checklist. You don't want to just create a checklist to create a checklist. You want to create something of value that they would possibly pay for, or something that would possibly help them. Another thing you want to implement is scarcity before the webinar. Here's what I mean by that. What you want to do is you want to ensure that your follow-up emails state that there is limited seating, and you want to utilize scarcity to ensure that they show up. So what I mean by that is in your emails, you want to say something like, I'm glad you signed up for the webinar. Make sure that you show up, because even though you signed up for the webinar, we have limited seating. So maybe realistically, let's say, for example, that 200 people sign up, but with GoToWebinar, you only have the basic plan. So you can only have 100 people sign up and show up and watch the webinar. So that leaves another 100 people not able to watch the webinar. They can watch the webinar replays afterwards. But if you state that, and of course you want to make sure that is true, then that will get more people to actually attend, because they don't want to lose the opportunity of not showing up and gaining information that you would give them, especially if you have some valuable information that you're going to share. So say something like, we have limited seating and we're almost filled up. So make sure you attend the webinar. So that really helps in itself. Another thing you want to do is remove the safety net. What I mean by that is this. Don't promise webinar replays beforehand. If you think about it, a lot of times we don't attend the webinar, not because we don't want to, but because we know that there's a webinar replay and that typically is standard. Do not promise webinar replays beforehand, and if by doing that, people will most likely show up so that they don't miss your content. But at the same time, like I said earlier, don't tell people that you're not going to have a webinar replay if you are. And don't promise anything similar that would actually prevent people from showing up. Now, other content, such as giving sneak peek preview content in all of the follow-ups leading up to the webinar, is helpful. So giving them that checklist, you might want to break down that checklist, and maybe the follow-up email after that, you can say something like, I'm glad you signed up. I hope you downloaded the checklist. If you haven't, here's the link, and make sure you fill this out before the webinar, because that's going to bring you X amount of results in your business if you implement this or if you take action. So your whole goal is to get them to take those mini actions, which ultimately brings them to the mini commitments and mini transactions when you pitch or sell something on your webinar. So remind people about your action list and your checklist. And remember, don't give everything. You want to be interesting but incomplete. So build curiosity, but don't tell people what is in the webinar, like all in detail. It's okay if you talk about it, overview, and the benefits. That's fine. Another thing that can help you is social proof. So if other people have tested out your products and services and they've said something about it, then add some social proof. If you got case studies, that's awesome. You can use it. You can maybe give that away initially, and then the day after or a few days later, you can say, I hope you got a chance to check out that case study. Remember, you can implement this, and I'm going to show you more case studies in the webinar. So if you like this case study, you'll want to show up, and so forth. So if you combine everything that I talked about in this video, you will increase your sales conversions. Hello, and welcome to video number 4. We're going to talk about the webinar email schedule. I'm going to go to a mind map so that you can see the full layout before the webinar and after the webinar. So let's move on to that mind map, and I'll show you exactly what you need to do. Okay, so here's the mind map, as you can see here. And everything before the webinar, I'm going to call it reminders, and everything after the webinar, we're going to call it follow-ups. So I've color-coded it so that we've got it to be orange, and then we've got it to be red for the follow-ups. The initial email is basically going to say, thank you for signing up, and here's the checklist. The reason why I want you to include a checklist or an action list, a document, a PDF, or something that you will actually be covering in the webinar. So it all leads up to this point. So the whole goal here is not to just give them a checklist or a PDF document or whatever. That it's not just to give it to them. The whole goal is to get them to use it, to take those mini actions along the way. Because when you pull out that checklist and they've already got that checklist done, they get to follow along and use exactly what they checked off, exactly what they did, whatever the homework was as part of the checklist or the document, which leads up into the webinar. And at that point in time, they've taken so many mini actions that they've become mini commitments. And when you use that on the webinar, and it ultimately leads in to whatever you're trying to sell or product or service that you're trying to promote, your conversions are actually a lot higher because everything is congruent from the first to the webinar. So you got initial email here. What I recommend is probably follow up on the same week with some sort of checklist tips. So you can tell them, hey, if you haven't had a chance to grab the checklist, here it is. And make sure you give some tips about the checklist. So give your best tip. And then after that, what you want to do is you want to follow up closer to the webinar. So this could be like right after this here, or it could be a couple days. And then right here, this could be a day or 2 days before the webinar. And then, of course, you want to have a 1 hour before the webinar, so that even though people have it on their calendars, people forget. I've done it. I'm sure you've done it. I'm sure many people have done it. And they're thinking, oh no, I missed it. So that definitely helps them. Even though you have all of these, they're actually geared to give people value, to help people by reminding them. So as long as you're giving value along the way, most people don't care because they initially signed up wanting to receive more information about that. In this day and age, everybody's just doing a pitch fest. So you want to make sure you give value along the way. So a lot of people, what they do is just have that initial email and then maybe 1 hour before the webinar. But up to this point, most of the time, people forget. People forget that they even signed up for your webinar. So you want to make sure that you follow up throughout if your goal is to, of course, increase your conversions. If your goal is just to have a webinar, webinar, and your goal is not to really increase conversions, you got an educational webinar, then of course this would be different. But if your goal, which is I'm sure the majority of you, is that you want to increase your conversions, then this follow-up series will greatly help you. So of course, on the webinar, you can use a checklist, you can go over the checklist, and then after that, you want to have a replay typically about 24 hours after. You can email the full list. You can email the people that were unable to show up. So this is 24 hours after the webinar. Now, the second follow-up in red is a replay follow-up 72 hours before your close. So depending on when you want to close the offer, that's when you want to send it out. And then, of course, you want to send out a follow-up 24 hours before midnight. So for whatever day that you're going to close it on, you want to integrate that into here. Now, all along right here, you generally want to use a countdown timer to increase scarcity. So I hope you enjoyed that. Feel free to jot everything down as you go and customize it to your own needs. In the next video, I'm going to go in a lot more detail about the orange area here, and I'll show you exactly what email templates you can use.